In this lesson, we'll look at Exhibits C and D, the categories of evidence for species change. Exhibit C will be comparative anatomy. Charles Darwin is going to look at the anatomical structures of different species to try to find patterns and to see similarities and to try to explain those similarities. For example, in this slide, we see the limbs of a diverse array of species. Here we have the fin of a whale, the wing of a bat, the arm of a gorilla, the leg of a tortoise, the front limb of a T-Rex, and the wing of a bird. Now, anatomists at the time, in studying these limbs, identified a common bone structure to the limb. There was one bone connected to the shoulder, followed by two bones, and then a bunch of little bones and digits. And we're going to call this the one bone, two bone, digits common structure. So that's a pattern. All of these limbs share this bone structure. Now, why would all the limbs of very diverse organisms share this structure? So that's what we have to sort of explain. These limbs have diverse functions, but they have a shared structure. Why would that be? Well, at the time, the prevailing view among Christian thinkers and most naturalists at the time was the special creation hypothesis that this is somehow an indication of God's handiwork. And so perhaps God had a design for a general limb in God's mind. And when God was making limbs of different species, then just sort of tweaked the limb. So to kind of generate differences that would be adaptive for their particular lifestyle, but still shared the underlying bone structure, the one bone, two bone digits pattern. So the special creation hypothesis had an explanation that this revealed sort of God's design plan. Darwin, of course, is going to depart from that explanation and suggest a radically different idea, that this common bone structure, one bone, two bone digits, is a trait inherited from a common ancestor of all these different species. And so the idea is the common pattern reveals a feature of a long extinct common ancestor. All of these species today have inherited this common feature from that ancestor long ago, but in the intervening time, these limbs were crafted by forces in nature to perform different functions. Now, Darwin's going to use evolutionary trees to illustrate this idea of common ancestry. Evolutionary trees show the relationships of current species to each other. Species share common ancestors at different times in the past. So the way the tree works is you put the current species at the top of the diagram, and then you have these lines that converge as you go down the diagram, and this is going back in time. So here we see at the bottom of the diagram the common ancestor. So this would be a species living in the past that would have been the common ancestor of all three living species today. Now, if we consider the characteristics of the three species, we will notice that the leopard and the domestic cat here are more similar than either of these two are to the wolf. So the wolf and leopard are less similar than the leopard and the domestic cat. Now, Darwin has an explanation for why the leopard and the cat are more similar than the leopard and the wolf. He'll argue that these two species have many shared traits because they inherited them from a recent common ancestor. Notice then, this common ancestor is sometime in the past, but not as far back as the common ancestor of all three species. And so the recency of the common ancestor means there hasn't been much time for any differences to emerge in these two separated species. By contrast, the wolf and the leopard had a more distant common ancestor, which means there's more time for new changes to emerge in the two species, and so fewer shared traits. Now, let's use evolutionary trees to see how Darwin's going to explain the common bone structure in these diverse limbs of vertebrates. Here we see an evolutionary tree showing the evolution of vertebrates from a common ancestor down here. Here we have fish, so these would have been the first kind of swimming vertebrates in the ancient oceans. And then we're going to have the evolution of legs in amphibians. So the first tetrapods would have been amphibians. And notice all of these vertebrates up here are tetrapods. The reptiles, the birds, and the mammals have 4 limbs. So these legs emerged at this point in the history of vertebrate history. And the idea then is the reason all of these vertebrates today have 4 limbs is because the common ancestor of those land-living vertebrates had 4 limbs. So the one bone, two bone digits pattern was found in the common ancestor and inherited by all of the current tetrapod species. So tetrapods inherited the one bone, two bone digits pattern from a common ancestor amphibian, but the limbs changed over time as species adapted to new lifestyles. And Darwin had a kind of term for this. He called it descent with modification. So the common bone structure was inherited, but it was modified by forces in nature. In the evolution of whales, the limb was modified to become a fin. In bats and birds, the limb was modified for flight. And in other kinds of species, modified for locomotion, or the T-Rex with the claws for a certain kind of activity in tearing up prey, for example. So Darwin is going to reject the idea that the common bone structure found in the limbs of vertebrates is due to God's sort of general limb plan. Rather, Darwin's going to say the common bone structure is the result of descent with modification. The common ancestor had this bone structure and passed this structure along to its descendants. Now, another interesting discovery among comparative anatomists was the presence of vestigial structures in members of different species. Now, we'll see that vestigial structures are going to challenge the intelligent design, the special creation hypothesis. Well, what are these vestigial structures? They're parts that don't seem to have a current function. And so if scientists discover different kinds of organs or structures in species that don't perform any function, it raises questions about the intelligence of God's design process. Why would God design organisms that have parts that don't work or don't have a function? For example, consider this fish up here at the top is a sighted fish. Its eyes work perfectly well. But there exist around the world blind fish. And oftentimes they inhabit caves where no light enters. Now, what's interesting is that these blind cave fish, they do have some eye parts, but they don't work. So they have eye structures, but they don't have a functioning eye. Raises a question, why have any eye parts at all? If God were creating these species, why would God make these fish have any eye parts if they're going to be blind anyway? And so this posed a challenge to the special creation hypothesis. Now, Darwin's going to use the concept of species change to explain this phenomenon of the blind cave fish with eye parts that don't work. Darwin's going to argue that the ancestors of the blind fish were seeing fish, sighted fish. So the ancestors had functioning eyes. But at some point in the evolutionary history of this species, some of them migrated into the cave environment. And in this cave environment, there was no penalty for non-working eyes. So mutations may have accumulated in building eyes and made them non-functional. But it didn't matter because there was no light in the cave for them to see anyway. Now, remember, it was only some of these fish, perhaps. Others of those ancestors continued being fish with functioning eyes. Now, why is it important to have eyes out in the ocean? Well, when there is light, you want to be able to see predators, for example. So eyes make sense if there's light to capture. But in the cave with no light, there's no penalty for non-working eyes. And so Darwin's going to argue then we can explain the leftover parts of the eye in these fish because this species changed from an ancestor that had functioning eyes. Now, you might ask the question, why not just maintain the eyes? So you can live in the cave, but why not just keep your eyes? What's the advantage to losing eyes? Well, eyes take energy to build and maintain, and eyes can get infected. So, in fact, here, Darwin's going to argue that there may well be advantages to losing the functionality of some parts, in this case, eyes in the blind cave fish. But again, the big idea here is Darwin's going to use vestigial structures like these eye parts that don't work as evidence of species change. These vestigial structures are leftover parts from an ancestor that had functional parts.